Welcome back to Everyday Anarchism, the show that finds mutual aid, cooperation, and non domination in your everyday life. I am your host, Graham Culbertson. I got that phrase non domination from an absolutely brilliant scholar, Ruth Kinna, who is joining me today to discuss anarchism, Santa Claus, and Christmas. That conversation, the first of two Christmas episodes from Everyday Anarchism, after the theme music. My guest today is Ruth Kinna, professor of political theory at Loughborough University. Loughborough, is
Correct.
it? Okay.
Very good.
If you're a regular listener to this podcast, you've already heard all about her book, The Government of No One, which I recommend is the best starting point for the history and theory of anarchism. But she's here today to discuss her article, An Anarchist Guide to Christmas. Ruth, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
So I thought we could just start with, well, first I should say it's just such a pleasure to see and talk to you, having read your work and indeed read your work out loud into this microphone. So my listeners will know who you are already. So you're a very, very minor celebrity with a few hundred listeners of Everyday Anarchism, if that,
Well,
if
it's
that
great to
counts.
hear.
I thought we'd just start with that article that you wrote for Strike about Kropotkin, anarchism, and Christmas. How you came up with the idea of writing it and what the reaction to it was.
So I have to say, it wasn't really my idea to start off with. The editor of Strike, who I'd got to know a little bit, because I'd written some other pieces for Strike magazine, and it's a lovely magazine. It was a lovely magazine. It's now been sort of replaced by something called Dope, but it does all kinds of art and politics and contemporary kind of anarchism. But he contacted me and said, would I write something on Christmas, anarchism and Christmas? And it was a short deadline. It was the next day. I mean, he was a bit more flexible than that, but ideally he wanted it the next day. And it just usually what happens with pieces like this is that I have to think about them for quite a long time, because just trying to think about writing something without it sounding too academic, if you like, trying to get the tone right, trying to get the hook, if you like, trying to get the hanger, I find quite difficult. And normally it takes me some time, and I don't know what happened, but it just appealed to me. It wasn't long before Christmas, and I suppose, you know, it wasn't it's not an original thought to think that someone like Kropotkin could pass for Father Christmas. You know, the big white beard, and I just it just sort of, the penny dropped, I suppose, or I just had this idea that I could think about Kropotkin and Christmas. So that was the way in, and then think about how far I was going to try and establish a link to Father Christmas, to St. Nicholas. So, and it wrote itself very quickly, and I just sent it off, and it seemed to be received quite well. I mean, the thing that was, I suppose, troubling about it is that, because I've spent a lot of time working on Kropotkin and reading Kropotkin, so it seemed to me that, I mean, it was a very light-hearted piece. It was intended to be light-hearted. But I, at one point in the manuscript, or in the essay, I refer to this manuscript, and I think a lot of people thought there was one, and I regret now that I didn't make it absolutely clear that this was a kind of a fiction, and not to be taken seriously as such, but seriously in terms of, I suppose, what I wanted to say about the message of Christmas and its the way it could be anarchized, and the way in which it has been subverted. So that was the point of it.
Oh, it's a wonderful piece. I guess I'll link to it in the show notes. I think it is gone from the Strike website, because I think the Strike website might be gone. But
Defunct.
it's up a few places on the internet.
Yeah,
That's one thing I love about anarchist texts is people don't seem to spend too much energy doing copyright takedowns for
no,
them.
and there's no copyright on it anyway. It was republished in Open Democracy as well.
Yes. Okay.
Years later, but it is you can Google it and it comes up quite quickly.
I think the last time I googled it, I found it in Open Democracy. So
Yeah.
listeners, you can Google it, but you can also just take a look at the notes, and I will have a link in there. One thing I was struck about that article. So I'm going to do 2 Christmas episodes because I love Christmas, and I think everyone needs Christmas this year. And the other one is there's a Twilight Zone episode about Christmas that I'm reading as a sort of Shakespearean romance. In that story, and in The Miracle on 34th Street, and even in this movie Elf with Will Ferrell, the abundance of the department store and then the cruel lack of abundance for the children on the street are always juxtaposed. And I think you mentioned that in the article as well. There's just something about the lavish opulence of a department store and the way that they stand for Christmas, they sponsor Christmas. The big parade in New York is the Macy's parade, and yet in some sense they seem completely against the spirit of Christmas. Everything is for sale. Nothing is free. There's no sharing. There's no caring. There's no giving in a department store. It seems to me.
No, and I think there are 2 things about that. I mean, I think one is the way that the Christmas shops are set up in the big stores. I mean, I remember as a child going into Christmas stores in places like Selfridges, which is one of the big shops on Oxford Street in London. And they were, I just found them magical. I mean, just the lights and the sparkle and the, just the intensity of the whole thing. And you're right. And it's an incredibly exclusive audience that it attracts. But I think the other thing about it is that, I mean, when I was a child, I used to think that there was a kind of a gift giving that went on in these things. I was completely oblivious to the fact that the children who were given gifts by Father Christmas were given gifts because their parents had paid already, and you just didn't know about it. And the same thing I remember going to a Christmas party, a children's party at my father's sort of works do. This was when I was about, I don't know, 5 or 6, and we were all given gifts. It was fantastic. I mean, all these kids there, 100 of us or so, and the same thing. You sort of thought, well, this was free. But because it wasn't, they'd probably taken it, straight out the pay packages in order to fund this. So there's a concealment, I think, in the giving exercise that goes on, as well as an exclusion, which is really problematic.
Yes, and I do think, I mean, I love the idea of Santa Claus, of Father Christmas, but it does seem that he is also used to obscure, poverty and class distinctions, because everyone gets presents from Santa, and that's simply not true. So my field was the 19th century novel, and there's all sorts of language in those texts, not related to Christmas, but just everyone is out of town. I think very early in Portrait of a Lady, the British noble guy says something like, "Oh, you can't go to London. There's no one there right now." And the American he's talking to says, "Are there not millions of people there?" And that I think it's this concealment. There's no one there, meaning there's no one.
Yeah, there's no one worth your worry. Yeah.
Yes, and Santa is supposed to be for everyone, but as far as Santa is the product of capitalism and your parental wealth bracket, Santa is not for everyone.
Yeah.
At all.
Yeah, and I think that's possibly why anarchists have sort of targeted Santa, dressing up as Santa, going into the stores, giving the presents away, actually, using the disguise, if you like, to play the stores at their own game. And that was also something I was familiar with, and something that the essay draws on, if you like, that this is a kind of rebellious act, and it's one that restores the idea of giving in ways that stores want to control.
Yes. So one of my obsessions in this podcast, it certainly comes from Graeber, and I was talking to Ian Forrest at Oxford, and he's a little more skeptical than I guess I am or Kropotkin is the idea that so much of our world, especially our, Hobsbawm says 1789, so much of our post 1789 world has hidden so many things that we could describe as fairly anarchist. I would say. I mean, Christmas and department stores have always gone together, right? Except department stores are not that old. They're only 120
That's
years old.
right.
There's Christmas before department stores, and when you say, "Oh, we could have a Christmas that's not this crass and commercial," it's very easy to imagine because this level of commercialism is a late 19th century product, and you've got the whole of human history, and Christmas is thousands of years old that can be reclaimed from this. I
I
feel
think
like.
that's right. Yeah, I think that's right. And I think if you think about the ways in which giving is institutionalized in other religions, actually Christmas looks rather paltry. I mean, if you think about, the way that Sikhs organize food, the way that Muslims organize giving as part of their practice, these are not unusual ideas. And it's a shame in a way that I mean, for as much as church officials, if you like, also complain about the commercialization of Christmas and the fact that we lose sight of the Christian message, the fact that it's Christ's birthday and all the rest of it. We tend to forget, I think, within all of that this is about the giving.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the thing that I suppose is both sort of attractive about Christmas, but also its real limitation. We love the idea of this giving. We love the idea of getting together. We love the idea of the holiday. I think that's a great big part of it. That the fact that you get, special holidays, which otherwise, you're going to be, you have to spend all your time sort of working in these stores or making the money to afford the stuff that's in them. So all of this comes together and we think of it as a really special time, but we're not quite sure how we can, as you say, reclaim it so that we focus on perhaps, not just the time we spend with each other and what we want to say to each other, but how we could extend those practices and make them more like our everyday lives and less like the climax to the year.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. That's fascinating. It does seem that Christmas is a sort of, Graeber and Wingrove in the new book, The Dawn of Everything, right, about seasonality and the idea of the carnival and the world turns upside down. And I guess there's two problems with it from this respect that we've already gotten to. One is that it's only for one day of the year or 2 days. I don't know, Boxing Day or 12 days. Certainly, no one does more than 24 days, as far as I know. So it really is a brief period of time. And then the other thing is, as we have already discussed, if the rich kids are getting the most presents from quote Santa, then the world isn't turned upside down
No.
at all. I can imagine, this is the next thing I wanted to ask you about, people who consider Christmas just a grotesque capitalist satire on the idea of giving, and I want to reclaim it. But I'm sympathetic to the idea, that Christmas should be destroyed. And of course, pagans, Wiccans, Saturnalia, there's all sorts of people who think we can and should. It's too late. It's time to discard that sort of Christian imagery. That's not the camp I'm in, but I guess I want to know what you say. I mean, I'm sure you've run into this idea, and what's your response to that? Can you defend Father Christmas against Wiccans?
I suppose I'm conflicted in a way. I mean, did I bring I brought my son up in similar ways in terms of Christmas to the ways I was brought up, with something of the mythology, if you like, something of the tinsel magic. I mean, I am a sucker for that.
Yeah, me too.
But could I do without it if I thought that there would be some greater kind of reflection, if you like, on being part of a community and what that means? Yes, I could I could do without that. I don't actually see that we have to do one thing or the other. I think the problem is how we sort of recuperate something that's been recuperated, and make it our own. And I think, people do that. People share. I mean, people, get into public spaces. There is a sort of a build up to this, which is not so intensely focused on the actual day or all of the stresses that often go with that day. Because we have to remember that, for a lot of families, actually, this is an absolutely dreadful time of year associated with stress, with feuding, with disappointment, with all of those things, and just trying to manage the logistics of doing all the work that goes into all of this. So I think I would, I want to relax on all of those things. I'd want to have more time. I think we need to sort of, there are ways that you can think about, what is it that you're doing in the build up that you could kind of even out, so that you haven't got this kind of curve, if you like, that takes you to this point of exchange,
Yes.
which is then basically controlled, or at least regulated, by the expectations of the stores.
Yes, absolutely. And Graeber and Wingrove also point out that it's frustrating. You go to the grocery store. I mean, at least in America, you go to the grocery store, and during this time of year, they ask if you will donate $1 to a food bank. And some of the grocery stores do things like that year round, but most of them don't. It's like 11 months of the year, suffering, poverty, food insecurity, homelessness. Those are okay. But we're all gonna, and then there's the whole tradition of, again, there's something grotesque about it. Even as it comes, this is something my family did as a child, was giving Christmas gifts, sponsoring poor families. I remember that one of the first times I saw poverty was when we went and gave gifts to these children. And I guess it felt good at the time, but in retrospect, it feels shallow. It feels, although I do recall, this is a memory I had forgotten, after we did that. So my father was a pastor, a conservative Calvinist pastor. But after we did that, I remember he went, he was the sole pastor of his church. He went to the elders and was like, we've got to do something different. So in that, we've got to do something for these people, not just at this time of year. So in that respect, this one moment did create something that could maybe be a little more lasting. But I'm certainly sympathetic to your ambivalence. It does seem so fraught in so many ways, anarchizing Christmas.
Yeah. And I think that, I suppose the point about, or one of the things about anarchism, is that, if you can find the spaces, and you can find or start the dialogue, then it's up to the people who participate, if you like, to think about different ways in which they might change the practice.
Yes, absolutely. And it also seems to me that we have, I imagine it's roughly the same way in the UK, but at least in America, we have lost almost all of our communitarian practices. I have some very good friends from St. Albans, and they were over at our house recently, and one of them said, you don't do caroling over here, Graham, do you? And I thought about it, and some church groups do, but that's it. And the idea of community caroling, I think, is probably, please, listeners, write me in if you live in the US and caroling is part of your life. But I think that the whole set of practices that can be associated with whatever you want to say, the village, the community, the town, in America, at least, it seems like we have suburbs and giant city centers. We don't seem to have a lot in between. And so if you do have this moment of coming together at Christmas, there's not the, I don't like it, you're right, I don't want to use the word institutions, but there's not the like set of practices and moments of coming together that can sustain that I can think of.
That's really interesting, because we still have, I don't know what they do at schools anymore, but certainly you see, people in town centres, in various sort of groups, singing. So you do get that. But Loughborough is near the city of Leicester, which is called the first minority majority city. So it's the first city in the UK where the majority of its residents are from Southeast Asian backgrounds of one sort or another. And one of the things that happens in Leicester not long before Christmas is Diwali. So there's a huge celebration that goes on for Diwali. In fact, when I went into Leicester a few years ago, I think there was a notice I saw that said, remember that, the lights are not just for Diwali, because the default is Diwali. The default is not Christmas. And I'd be interested. I mean, not that I've seen what goes on in Leicester City for Christmas, but in Diwali, I mean, this is a huge gathering of the communities together. So it's perfectly possible to use festivals in these ways, but I'm just not sure that we have the habit anymore of doing it with Christmas.
The habit, yes, it is a habit. Oh, that makes perfect sense. Do you know the work of Randolph Bourne? He's an early 20th century American writer.
Only the war.
War is the health of the state.
Yeah,
He gets claimed sometimes in an anarchist tradition. So I studied the American pragmatist tradition, which I've found tons of connections with anarchism. Most famously, Kropotkin visits Jane Addams, and she says he's very nice, but I'm not an anarchist. I'm a Tolstoyan, which it's like, oh, you're so different. You're so different. If you're following Tolstoy versus, and actually that's one of the parts of your book that I've quoted is, Bakunin or Kropotkin and Tolstoy. Yeah, they're pretty similar, except for the use of the word anarchism. But Bourne writes that when people come to America in the late 19th and the early 20th century, when immigrants come, they are forced to have their culture stripped away, but there's nothing to replace it. I mean, he's writing in the teens.
This is the essay on transnationalism.
Yes, on transnationalism,
which is really interesting.
It's a lovely essay, and he's writing so early. I mean, certainly before the rise of talkies, and he says we just give them, movies, and he doesn't quite say fast food, but he says like, bland homogenized food, and it's like, oh, Randolph Bourne knew exactly where this was going, a giant country with no communities. And it does make sense that if you want these traditions that have been stripped away and destroyed by capitalism, managerial feudalism, whichever word you like, that it may come from immigrants and outsiders and people who have needed these traditions to survive in this homogenized world that capitalism has created.
It's it's a long time since I read that essay, but I seem to remember him, the warning that he gives at the end, which is that the corporations will step in.
Yes.
If this vacuum, to fill this vacuum. But I think that's what he says, and if I remembered it correctly, then I think that's right.
It is what he says, and that's the Christmas we have now. It's the Coca-Cola Christmas.
Yeah, which has then been globalized.
Yes. Oh, yes. Yeah, it is. It has been globalized. There's a YouTuber who lives in Japan. He's from the UK somewhere. I don't know where he's from, and he says he cannot stand Christmas in Japan because it's, I don't know if he blames it on us Americans, but he probably does, because Japan has full on American capitalist Christmas, no sense of giving or giving. I mean, of course there's giving, but it's, fully the capitalist, it is better to receive than give sense. So he can't stand it. And so he tries to go home. He doesn't travel outside of Japan that often, but he tries to go home for the UK for Christmas because at least alongside the American Coca-Cola Christmas, there are these things like caroling and togetherness. And Japan, the only version they have is the version created by the corporations in that great American century. And it does seem again that we have exported that to everyone. I take no responsibility. I didn't do it. If only it was so easy to say I take no responsibility. It would be,
these forces are powerful, and you know, they play with our norms and values in complicated ways, and it's difficult sometimes, I think, then to work out exactly what it is you can reclaim, if anything. I think the corporations, I mean, and I think it's very evident at Christmas, they don't operate with any kind of cultural reference points. And it's the fact that they play with the cultural reference points in the ways that they do, and they manipulate them, that makes the way in which Christmas is presented back to us so troubling.
The example of Japan makes perfect sense
Yes.
because, something like KFC, the people who run KFC are, I'm sure, some mix of Americans who don't care about the cultural traditions of Christmas, as you described, and Japanese people who know nothing about the cultural connections of Christmas except its value for their brand. So that sort of cultural disconnection, of course you're going to get that in cultures that do not have Christmas. And the Japanese have all sorts of wonderful, wonderful
Yeah.
cultures of togetherness and communitarian and giving and sharing. But Christmas
Isn't one of them.
Yes. Christmas isn't one of them. I guess, I've focused mostly on the corporate capitalist Christmas, but I guess I should also, and this ties into, my Calvinist upbringing as well. There's also the, Santa Claus sees when you've been naughty and sees when you've been nice version of Christmas. So Santa, in this sense, your book is called The Government of No One. He is the ultimate governor, and at least God is going to mete out his rewards and punishments after death. And so that gives you the chance, if you want, to do the sort of Camus thing and just hold your middle finger up to him and say, you can punish me later, but not now. Well, Santa supposedly at least will punish you, on December 25th. And these days, I don't think anyone gets coal. I don't know how real that tradition is. I should probably ask someone from Bavaria. I can imagine that being the place to where Krampus is running and giving people coal and everything. But this idea that Santa is helping your parents assert their authority over you, that seems to be another problem. As much as I want to anarchize Christmas, it's another problem, but I wanted to see what you thought about.
Yeah, well, it's a classic carrot and stick, isn't it? That, if so Santa becomes the sort of the disciplinary tool.
Yes.
So if you're good, you get something. If you're not good, then you don't. So this is the way that schools work. It's the classic do as I say, or there's going to, for reward or to avoid punishment. And I think that's a I hadn't actually thought about that until you pointed it out. That it's in the song.
It's in the song. Yes.
It's incredible actually when you think about it. And I guess, from the anarchist point of view, I mean, the whole idea of disciplining people like that is so counterproductive and so corrupting, but I think the other thing is, on another level, is that it assumes, if you like, that there's that what's naughty and what's nice is already settled, that we have these moral standards, right? And that these are evident.
Yes.
And because, I think anarchism wants to muddy that a bit, and not deny the existence of norms, but not to fix them. That's the whole point. That as soon as you have sort of single points of authority, as soon as you have single moral systems or fixed moral systems, then of course you're going to be institutionalizing the interests that those systems support. And so from every point of view, the idea of the disciplinary Santa is so perverse. It's just trying to make the traditional school head look acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
That I think that's what it does. I mean, it's not, as I say, I hadn't really thought about it, so I don't know how far back that goes.
Oh, I don't know either.
And what kind of, it'd be really interesting to see what kinds of different images of Santa you get around the sort of the mid 19th century, where you do have this sort of proliferation, I think, of imagery.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. I mean, very loosely, I think Foucault suggests that kind of discipline and punishment institutionally is not that old. Is again kind of equal with modernity, or whatever you want to call it, the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution. So it's hard to imagine Santa saying, if you sit in your seat and look at the chalkboard, you will be rewarded in the 12th century, because kids were not, I mean, unless you were being trained as a monk or something, kids were not in this school, in this kind of institution. I actually hadn't thought of it. I mean, I was definitely thinking, Ruth, of this as a tool for parents, but you're absolutely right. The model is the principal, right?
Yeah.
The teacher says, or school head, I guess is the term in the UK. The teacher, or even worse, what do they call them? What's the name for the like prefect, the leader of the class who's in charge of discipline at
I mean, the head girl or head boy.
Yes, the teacher or the head girl or head boy says, if you're not good, I will tell the head of the school, who is this awesome figure from on high.
Yeah, reporting systems. Yeah.
Yes. And this is a reporting system.
Yeah.
I'll tell Santa, My parents didn't say that, because I was not taught that Santa was real, for fear that my image of Jesus and my image of Santa would get muddled. So, but I know that people do tell their children, if you're not good, Santa, I'll report you to the principal.
Yeah, no, I didn't have that either. I mean, the Santa I knew was the night before Christmas, where Santa is slightly drunk.
Ruth, it could be that the problem with America is just that we don't have pubs. That we do not have a sense of convivial community that may or may not involve alcohol. Because when I went to the UK, there's nothing like that in America.
Because when I was a youth, of course, one of the things that was exceptional about Christmas was the licensing hours. Because we used to, the pubs used to shut at 10:30. But you could have extended licensing hours, so you could sort of roll out of the pubs and go straight into midnight mass, which people did. I mean, partly to keep warm and partly to keep the thing going. But now, of course, we have extended licensing hours any time you like. So that kind of sense of being able to do something that you weren't normally able to do has kind of got lost. But I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it was just something that was noticeable about Christmas when I was growing up.
Oh yeah, that is very interesting. So I mean, it seems to me that I've mostly made a case against an anarchist Santa Claus, against an anarchist Christmas. I do think, and I think I mentioned already that I've written but not recorded an episode about the Twilight Zone version of. The Twilight Zone version of Christmas, which is really, as most of the great Christmas texts are just versions of the Dickens Christmas Carol, at least in the English tradition. But it seems to me that there still remains a subversive power in Christmas. There is still the idea in Christmas that it is better to give than to receive, that this is a time where everyone comes together. This is a time where strangers will sing to one another. And I at least don't want to give that up. I want to anarchize it rather than burn it down, which is my approach in general to most things.
And I think also this, this collective down tooling, this is the idea of having the holiday, which from mid 19th century or early 19th century was used by early socialists to think about approaches to work and also to property. So there's this guy called William Bembo, I don't know if you know, came up with the idea of the Grand National Holiday, which was actually to radicalize the holy days and turn them into something like a general strike. He also suggested bringing back the Jubilee, the idea of the Jubilee, so that every 7 years all the property gets redistributed. And so I think there are things like that we can take inspiration from, and try and work out what it is that we like about Christmas, and then just jettison the rest. but certainly I think the idea of not work, which of course only works on the basis that some people continue to work,
Right.
but those ideas I think are worth playing with. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think you're right. This ties back to the Graeber and Wingrove book, at least in my mind as well. There are so many different ways to organize society, to relate to one another, and
Mm,
the classic move for communism. And frankly, I'm not a big fan of Marxist, Leninist, Maoist, Stalinist communism. I don't think that will come as a surprise to you. But the common move is to say, hey, we should do things differently. We should redistribute the wealth. And then, it's always the teacher, at least for me, it was the teacher would say, well, they tried that in the Soviet Union and
mm,
X million of people died. So this is it. This is,
mm,
capitalism with some sort of welfare safety net is as good as it's going to get. And if you ask for anything else, you are asking for Stalin or Mao. And
mm.
I simply don't believe that. And I think
No.
that Christmas of the past and these various other seasonal traditions, Jubilee, everything, they're right there. They're right
Yeah.
there.
But I think also, I mean, one of the interesting things, or one of the positive things that's come out of the pandemic, is actually how many mutual aid societies have sprung up. I mean, particularly in the early months of the pandemic, and they weren't all anarchists, but quite a lot of anarchists were involved in them, and some of them are anarchist. And I think that's a great example, if you like, of people just deciding to help each other because we're in the same predicament, and some of us are not handling it as easily as others. To not worry that someone's a stranger, to think about which institutions you want to support and why. And in the UK, of course, the NHS was one of those. So people were sewing scrubs up because the hospitals were running out of them. All of these kinds of examples of practice of giving without expectation of receiving anything in return. That's what it's about. And I think if we can have rituals which make that practice also like a party, that's great too. But
you got to be able to dance to the revolution.
Has to be the norm, doesn't it?
Yes. Oh, yes, absolutely. And I think I'm sorry I cut you off a little bit. I said you have to be able to dance to the revolution, which is maybe quoted a little too much, but just because it's such a great quote. Yeah, I agree, and I think I wouldn't say I'm optimistic that some of the changes that took place during the pandemic will carry on, but it's very clear that they could. It's very clear to me. I hadn't thought of that in terms of seasonality. We did live a different way for 18 months and maybe for longer. And there's no reason, as near as I can tell, that we cannot keep doing things
that's right
that way.
And the memory persists.
It does.
I mean, I think part of the problem with anarchism is that, people often, the skeptics, if you like, will say, well, how's it going to work? Well, here's an example. This is how it has worked, without anybody orchestrating anything, without anybody organizing anything. It just happened. And the memory of those things and the experience of those things, I think, is important, whether or not each one of these organizations survives in the immediate short term. The fact is they were there, and that makes a difference.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, I think there's a lot to be said for using certain of the Christian scriptures and certainly the Christmas stories. When people say, the people who will inveigh against this reorienting of the society will usually be some version of Christian, or at least celebrate Christmas. And this is a moment to remind them that actually, we share the same ideals. I started signing my emails with in mutual aid, and one of my students said, "Dr. Culbertson, what happened to you?" And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, you're just so radical." And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Your email signature in mutual aid." I think he said, that's associated with radicalism. And I just shrugged, and I was like, I mean, if you help your neighbor across the street, that's mutual aid. If it's radical, that is the world's problem.
Yes, I agree.
This Christmas is actually not that radical. Being nice to everyone else, that seems that seems pretty normal to me, or rather should seem
Mm,
normal. The world is turned upside down now, and it's Christmas where we put it the right way up, and let's
mm.
remember that. That's what I would say. Anyway, sorry, I
Yeah,
got a little impassioned there.
that's a nice thought.
Okay, I think unless you have anything else to add, I think we've done what we came here to do, and I've taken
Yeah,
up
no, I
your
really
time.
enjoyed that a lot. It was a lovely it's lovely to think about. It's lovely to think about Christmas and anarchism and the relationship between the two. And yeah, yeah, maybe there is something prefigurative about Christmas practices that we can tap into.
I say let's work on it at least. All right,
Yeah.
Ruth. Thank you so much for appearing on the show. This was
Well,
wonderful.
thank you for talking to me.
Wow, that was amazing. I've got so much to think about. So much to think about from Ruth about Christmas and anarchism. Remember, next time there will be another Christmas episode, this time just me, and I'll be talking about the Twilight Zone episode, The Night of the Meek. If you can watch that episode in the next week, I know it's on Hulu. It's season 2, episode 11, The Night of the Meek of the original series of Twilight Zone. I think you will really enjoy it, but I think you'll enjoy the episode even if you haven't had a chance to watch it. Remember, I could really use your questions and comments at everydayanarchismpodcast@gmail.com. And I could really use your support, your financial support, if you can go to everydayanarchism.com and make a monthly pledge, or if you can simply tell a friend, share the show on social media, or leave me a review on Apple Podcasts. That helps keep the show alive. All that's left to say is that the theme music, which you're about to hear, is by David Hill.